Well, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce to you today, this morning, Ruslan Dzarasov. He comes to us from Moscow, from the Plekhanov Russian University of Economics, where he's the head of the Department of Political Economy. He's also part-time, I understand, research fellow at the Central Institute of Economics and Mathematics at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He did his PhD at Staffordshire University in the UK. It was about 10 years ago, I believe.
Yes, about 10 years.
And I think, as you can maybe see if you take a look at his works, from that he's got excellent training in heterodox economics. So as a heterodox economist, I think this is fantastic. Really great stuff. His PhD thesis, which I just jotted down the title here, which is Insider Control and Investment Behavior of Russian Corporations, I think marked the advent of a really important and really interesting and really robust research, a line of research and research work. He's published in both, certainly I know English and Russian languages, perhaps other languages as well that I don't know. But for English readers, I think his work probably first came to wider attention, certainly among economists, with the publication in 2011 of a very important and I think really first-rate article in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. It seemed to come out of that, out of the thesis and out of that research agenda. And the title of the article, Eignerian Megacorp and Investment Behavior of Russian Corporations. And I think now, looking at that article and indeed looking back at the research over the last 10 years, what I think Ruslan has essentially done here is opened up the lid to Russian capitalism and really laid bare and exposed the inner structure, inner mechanisms, and really go right to the heart of the corporation and how what's happening to a big chunk, big slice of the surplus that's generated by Russian workers, and introduced a really nice analytical framework for that, some important concepts. I really like this sort of idea of insider rent, which I think is really important in terms of looking at corporations. And I fear, actually, these days, may not just be confined to Russia anymore, though Russia is certainly the archetype of that. So that research has shown up in a number of other publications, maybe most notable, a more expanded and broader treatment in his book in 2014, published by Palgrave, titled, as I recall, The Conundrum of Russian Capitalism, and really worth taking a look at. He's published a range of other things. I think most recently he has a chapter in the Palgrave Handbook of Critical International Economics. I think chapters on the Russian economy, as I recall. And that just came out last year in 2016. So it's a real treat, I think, to have him here. I think we're in for a treat this morning, and I'm not going to take up any more time. As you probably know perhaps from yesterday, the sort of format here is I will allow the speaker approximately 55 minutes for the delivery of his presentation. And then I think I'll just open it up to the floor so that we can take questions and have some discussion and interaction thereafter till our time is up. So without any further time, please welcome me, please join with me in welcoming Ruslan Dzarasov.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I'm not sure that I fully deserve it, but it's very pleasant. And first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the organizers of this wonderful conference, and I want to say that for me it is a great event and great opportunity to present my case and address such a qualified audience as what I see here. And I will speak on post-communist society, global capitalism, and the Ukraine crisis. In fact, I will try to compare Russian Revolution, its legacy, and colored revolution, to compare these two phenomena. Ukraine crisis is probably the most acute geopolitical clash between Russia and the West since the end of the Cold War. And it is natural that it is depicted sometimes as a start of the new Cold War. And this is the major paradigm for which Western dominant right-wing intellectuals analyze these phenomena. If we turn to Western left, then here the idea of two imperialisms, Russian and American, clashing over Ukraine dominates. I think that both accounts of this crisis are false. And I believe that in order to get real insight into this event, we should look at it from the broader historical perspective of Russian Revolution, of its historical legacy. And I mean both the legacy of the triumph of Russian Revolution in October 1917 and in the light of its later failure. Both these events formed the modern post-Soviet societies and shaped their history. I think that Russian Revolution was a product of the law of uneven and combined development, which was suggested by Lenin and developed later by Trotsky. This approach anticipated, I think, Walt's system analysis, which depicts the history of capitalism through the lens of core-periphery relations, and it reflects domination of the core over periphery. For instance, as Andrei Günther Frank expressed in his famous development of anti-development model, that transnational capital of the core transforms peripheral economies, reducing their diversified economies to a few industries which fit economies of the core, mainly providing them with staple goods, and currently we can add by industrial goods as well. And on the other hand, the core countries transform social structure of peripheral societies, creating strong comprador bourgeois class from feudal landlords, and depriving peasantry of access to land and converting it, transforming it into a pool of cheap labor. And in result, I think interpreting this from standpoint of Marxism, we can say that the essence of peripheral capitalism is in free transfer of part of surplus value created by population of these countries to transnational capital of the core. And in this light, we can understand Russian Revolution, because Tsarist Russia undertook great effort to industrialize itself, and it was done obviously on the basis of peripheral capitalism. Because Russian Tsarist industrialization was based on attracting Western capital in the country. And this was done due to accumulation of large golden and foreign exchange reserves. And these were accumulated due to export of cheap Russian grain in Europe, in Britain, France, Germany, and money was accumulated. That is why relatively high rates of industrialization in Tsarist Russia were accompanied by the corresponding decline of agriculture and impoverishment of Russian peasantry. Let us turn to a very interesting table, which compares per capita national income in Russia and its major competitors in the West. In 1861, when Tsarist Russia started its industrialization, and in 1913, the year when we can say that Tsarist attempt of industrialization was nearly completed. And if we turn to the fourth column, the last column for 1861, we will see the relation between Russian per capita income and in the countries, in other industrialized countries of the time. And we can see that in 1861, there was a huge gap between Russia and its major competitors. Russia is taken as 100%, and all variables are converted into Russian ruble of the time and taken in real terms. And then turn to the last column for 1930th, and we can see that the gap between Russia and main capitalist countries increased in the result of this industrialization. This is the fact which is not taken into account by modern Russian monarchists who like to argue that, well, revolution stopped development of Russia, which could be the dominant country of Europe. Of course it is false, because this table illustrates exactly the essence, economic essence of peripheral capitalism, which is, as I said, in the shift of significant amount of labor value created by Russian population in favor of the West. And Russian intellectuals of late 19th, early 20th century tried to cope with this reality. That is why Russian populists argued that capitalism will not develop in Russia, because Russia has too narrow domestic market, too narrow to provide conditions for accumulation of capital, and international market is already divided between the major capitalist countries. But Russian social democrats at first staunchly opposed this view, and they argued that capitalism is gradually developing in Russia, and Russia follows European way of development. They saw Russian Revolution, future Russian Revolution, which they anticipated, as a process taking two major stages. At the first stage, it will be Russian bourgeois-democratic revolution, which will remove all feudal obstacles to capitalist development, and capitalist development will increase, and it will develop to the full capacity, and only after all contradictions of capitalist development will mature, the socialist revolution will take place. However, the first Russian revolution challenged this dogmatic approach, and it brought two major sensations. First of all, the liberal bourgeoisie kept off the revolution. Yes, they organized some radical campaigns, banquet campaign, there was some local government movement and some other things. However important were these reforms and these acts, but in fact, liberal bourgeoisie didn't participate in insurrection and didn't try to lead other classes of Russian society against Tsarism. At the same time, Russian peasantry, which was up to that moment considered by social democrats as essentially reactionary class, because for more than 2 centuries after the failure of famous and very tragic Pugachev peasant insurrection in 18th century, Russian peasantry suffered silently. However, in 1905, Russian peasantry revolted. Unfortunately, its mass rebellion happened just after the city's workers' revolution was already broken. And the Bolsheviks was the only political party in Russia which drew lessons from the first Russian Revolution. And their discussions focused on the question of the hegemon of the socialist revolution in Russia. I mean the famous Lenin's theory of the overgrowth of bourgeois-democratic revolution into socialist one, and Trotsky's famous permanent revolution. Essentially, despite some differences, they were very close in their core ideas. Trotsky was not a Bolshevik at the moment, but suggesting theory of permanent revolution, he was inevitably driven closer to Bolsheviks. So their main idea was that Russian society is very different from European society from the standpoint of social structure. We have very weak small bourgeoisie which provides foundation for European liberal democracy. And big Russian bourgeoisie is too reactionary, and it is too dependent on Tsarism to be able to challenge it. That is why the hegemon of bourgeois-democratic revolution in Russia will by no means will be Russian bourgeoisie. It will be the working class. And it will lead bourgeois-democratic changes in union with poor and middle-income peasantry. But since Russian bourgeoisie will be unable to lead bourgeois democracy in Russia, Russian revolution will be in turn unable to limit itself with bourgeois democratic changes, because obviously you cannot establish bourgeois democracy without bourgeoisie itself. That is why Russian workers and peasants will be forced by history to move to social changes. Pay attention that neither Lenin nor Trotsky promoted an idea of socialism in one country. They're not speaking about building socialism in Russia, in isolated Russia. They're speaking about movement from bourgeois democratic to socialist changes, because they believed that it was impossible to construct, to build socialism in a backward country. But they were sure that socialist revolution in Russia will ignite socialist revolution in Europe, and then the problem of backwardness of Russian capitalism will be overcome with the help of European proletariat. And the second Russian revolution proved the Bolshevik vision basically adequate. And because Bolsheviks developed such a strategy which led to their triumph in this revolution, while Mensheviks, sticking to their idea of two independent stages of Russian revolution, they failed to suggest historical initiative, and they lost control over events. Because, in fact, right-wing and centrist Mensheviks and social revolutionaries gave power in February 1917 to the liberal Cadets party. And this party didn't use its domination over the provisional government to establish sound bourgeois democracy in Russia. In fact, their strategy was to suppress democratic freedoms, which were the real fruits of February Revolution, in order to suppress the Soviets and the socialist parties. That is why they put off convening constitutional assembly, which was expected to give Russia democracy and to solve the problems of land and of war. So they put it off in order to accumulate strength and suppress their left-wing competitors. And that is why they supported Kornilov uprising in August 1917, which was designed to introduce military dictatorship in Russia and use army to dismiss the Soviets and suppress left-wing parties. But this uprising miserably failed, and Russian workers and peasants realized that when Bolsheviks are crowded out from power and from politics, then their rights are under threat. That is how, after that event, Bolshevization of the Soviets started, and Bolsheviks became in a position to lead Russian revolution, which culminated in successful October 17th Bolshevik rebellion. I think this experience shows us something which is universal for historical change at peripheral capitalism. And I think that Gramscian understanding of the nature of bourgeois democracy gives us a powerful insight into the problem. Gramsci argued that bourgeois hegemony is based on socio-economic compromise with subordinated classes, which assumes that part of national income is redistributed in favor of toilers. Only on this basis, organic intellectuals are able to present interest of ruling elite as national interest, which assumes that bourgeois democracy has very important economic material foundation. And this foundation is wealth, part of which can be sacrificed in favor of toilers. And of course, the core capitalist countries, since they appropriate a large part of incomes created by population of the periphery, of course the core capitalist class of the core is in a position to sacrifice part of this surplus in favor of workers to buy by means of this political stability and to establish its hegemony. But what about the peripheral countries? Obviously, the peripheral capitalist societies, since their economic essence is in free transfer of part of their labor value in favor of transnational capital, they are not in a position to establish sound bourgeois democracy. In fact, such ruling classes, since they have to subjugate their population to double exploitation in their own favor and in the favor of transnational capital, they can rule only by authoritative and dictatorial methods. That is why bourgeois democratic movement is doomed to failure in conditions of peripheral capitalism. And if you want democracy in such societies, you have to overcome capitalism itself. And you simply cannot have bourgeois democracy. You can have only socialist democracy. But unfortunately, since Russian Revolution was isolated, the backward nature of Russian capitalism played in favor of Stalin, and this was a material objective precondition for degeneration of Russian Revolution with the victory of bureaucracy led by Stalin, which usurped many rights belonging to people and imposed its power through mass purges. And Trotsky analyzed the phenomenon of the Soviet society, and I think that The Revolution Betrayed is a masterpiece of historical materialism. And he explains that in contrast with what was asserted by Stalin's propaganda, the Soviet Union is by no means a socialist society. He argued that it is only a transitional society, which only attempts to build socialism, which means that it combines the elements of capitalism with elements of socialism, and it is essentially unstable. That is why Soviet bureaucracy is not a new exploitative class like feudal class or bourgeoisie, because it has its own place in history. It is not leading any particular social system, social formation. And he argued that Soviet bureaucracy is somewhere in between the interests of working classes and of bourgeois class. So its interests partially coincide with interests of workers, but partially contradict them. That is why the Soviet society is still a working state, but it is a degenerated working state. And Trotsky made a prophecy about the future of the Soviet Union. He said that since it is only a transitional society, it can move forward to socialism, but it can slide back to capitalism. That is the problem, because naturally, bureaucracy sooner or later will desire to strengthen its privileges with the help of private property. And if, in result of the looming Second World War, new socialist societies appear in Europe, which will represent a higher level of socialist organization, then the Soviet workers will return to power oppositions and oppositionaries who are incarcerated currently. And in this case, Soviet society will move to socialism. If this will not happen, then the backslide to capitalism is quite possible. Trotsky was unaware about the scale of Stalin purges and terror, and he didn't know that all oppositionaries of all kinds were simply killed in the Soviet Union. And probably Stalin had read his book, I think, sometimes, and this prompted him to eliminate, uproot oppositions completely. However, the prophecy of Trotsky proved to be absolutely scientific forecast. Due to a lack of alternative victorious socialist revolutions in Europe and due to isolation, the Soviet society, Soviet bureaucracy degenerated when Gorbachev removed his attempts to establish democracy was genuine, but when he removed the shackles of totalitarian society, Soviet bureaucracy was very glad to move to capitalism. But what kind of capitalism was established in Russia? By no means it corresponds to the dreams of Soviet people of 1990. It was expected that capitalism will introduce enormous economic efficiency, enhance living standards, and give us democracy, rule of law, and human rights. In fact, many people were deliberately persuaded that we are moving to the capitalism of the core. Nobody had any idea about the core-periphery relations and such kind of thing, I mean the wider public. However, Russian capitalism demonstrates clear features of a peripheral capitalist society. I mean huge outflow of capital from Russia. It is capital flight and many other instruments by means of which Russian comprador bourgeoisie moves part of incomes created in Russia abroad. However, in fact, it is not purely peripheral, but semi-peripheral, which means that the function of semi-periphery from standpoint of the ruling class of the core is that semi-peripheral country should control part of the periphery in favor of the core. And for this function, it is rewarded by some additional incomes, and bourgeoisie of the semi-peripheral country enjoys opportunity to get some fruit of this exploitation. However, Russian capitalism obtained this position, I think, due to legacy of the Soviet Union. Because if not for nuclear power, not for industrial potential, which is not ruined completely up to now, if not due to first-rate system of education and fundamental science, Russia, I believe, would broke down up to now just as the Soviet Union. And we see the semi-peripheral nature of Russian capitalism in the fact of the deep split in Russian ruling elite, where Eurasian integrators, which is a vague term, under which I mean those who are in favor of national capitalism, which has certain national interests and want to defend them, and pure comprador bourgeoisie which follows neoliberal economic policy and which is the driving force behind the capital flight from Russia, and which only dream is to get to the West and to be recognized by the Western elite and move their business here. Which is not happening, by the way. So this split and contradiction between these two fractions puts powerful limitations on any attempts of Russia either to get new industrialization or to strengthen its international positions. And we will see how it limits Russian position in course of Ukrainian crisis. However, if evolution of the Soviet society is one important factor of Ukraine crisis, the other important factor is the influence of global capitalism. And I believe that just as the key to understand Russian revolution and its fate is the law of uneven and combined development, it is also the major key to understand the dynamics of global capitalism. I think that it was shaped both by this law and by influenced by the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So the major trend of economic development of global economy since stagflation of the 1970s was the shift of production from global north to global south. Of course, it was designed to exploit cheap workforce of the periphery, and this was response of global capitalism to decline of profits of corporations in course of stagflation. And the insight into the forces which reshaped, into relations which reshaped global economy is provided by the famous flying geese paradigm, which is quite actual, referring to this when currently Canadian geese migrate to the south of the United States. So this model explains the hierarchy of Asian countries in terms of technologies. However, the founder of this model, Japanese Marxian economist Akamatsu, he focused on uneven relations inside this hierarchy of countries where value added is distributed according to your position in technological hierarchy. And those countries which are closer to the end of the order of the geese, they provide more labor intensive technologies, and they provide greater share of value added to the countries which are upper in this hierarchy. And I must say that Akamatsu based his flying geese paradigm on the law of uneven and combined development suggested by Lenin and Trotsky. He applied this law to Asian economies. And at the nature of these relations, the global value chain lays, and this approach from standpoint of global value chains explains that countries which occupy labor-intensive chains of production, they create additional value to enrich the countries which occupy the capital-intensive chains of production. And in international partnerships between transnational corporations and producers from peripheral countries, they establish these partnerships basing on this model of technological hierarchy to which uneven distribution of value added corresponds. And what is very interesting is that this global shift of production from the north to the south was enormously facilitated by breakdown of the Soviet Union. And the Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman explains why is it so. He explained that the area of security for Western investment in the periphery, or he uses other terms in the world economy, but we understand that he means periphery. So this sphere of security greatly expanded with the failure of the Soviet Union, because virtually the communist movement went into crisis, social orientation in the Third World virtually stopped, and many other things happened which made neoliberal attack on positions of peripheral countries much more efficient. And if we turn to the graph, we can see how enormously foreign direct investment in developing and emerging markets skyrocketed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, impressive was industrialization of the peripheral countries in the result. It led to inevitable crises. Western mainstream economics often depicts this crisis as coming only from financial sphere. It is financial crisis which disturbed world economy. But in fact, Marxian authors analyzing the world economic crisis have shown that the very growth of financial speculative capital was based on the global shift of production, because the world capital markets provided additional instruments of transfer of incomes created by peoples of the periphery to transnational corporations. That is the material foundation for enormous growth of financial speculative assets and of all these infamous financial bubbles. So this means that the law of uneven and combined development explains us the foundations of this crisis. And I must say that since world capitalism moved to this crisis even faster after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was something like post-human revenge of the Soviet Union on its Cold War competitor. I believe that enormous exacerbation of international relations and exacerbation of international conflicts, which we witnessed last decade, happened due to this total crisis of capitalism. Because core capitalist countries, transnational capital in fact, has only two ways to survive this crisis. Either to reform capitalism, but this would mean to subjugate financial sphere to industrial capital. And industrial production moved to Asian countries. So this means that the relations and the domination of countries in the world arena should change. Of course, transnational corporations of the core are not eager to do that. And then they have only second way out of the crisis. They have to move the greater part of this burden to periphery countries. And highly industrialized in the last decades, BRICS countries have to assume greater burden of this world economic crisis. And I think this strategy is beyond the international conflicts. And we can trust to George Friedman heading famous Stratfor think tank of CIA that aims of the US strategy in Eurasia for the last century was in prevention of any power from uniting peoples and resources of the continent. And George Friedman argues that we waged 2 wars against Germany when she made pretense on this position. Then we waged a few decades of Cold War when the Soviet Union tried to occupy this position. If we continue his idea, then now we have new superpower, emerging superpower, China, which can make pretense. And that is, this automatically makes China the major enemy of United States. And I think that Russia, being a semi-peripheral country, from standpoint of American elite, fails to fulfill, to carry out its function. Russia should join United States in strategic isolation of China. That is why containment of Russia and isolation of China are the main aims of United States in Eurasia. And in fact, Russia, for Russian ruling elite, all post-Soviet times, with gradually increasing concern, observed some hostile movements on the part of the West. And according to Russian elite, this list of hostile moves includes NATO expansion to the east, a number of coward revolutions in the former Soviet space which led to power anti-Russian governments, NATO involvement in the Balkan Civil War, where they facilitated military debacle of historical ally of Russia, Serbia, and attempts to establish the third district of the US anti-missile defense system in Eastern Europe, which is seen in Russia as a mortal threat. Attempts to extend NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia, this is seen as intrusion into the heartland of Russia. And Eastern European partnership programs designed to tear Russian neighbors from Russia, because one of the conditions of these programs is that countries should reorient their economic relations to European Union at the expense of their relations with Russia. And of course, the new great game started in Central Asia for domination over the energy-rich Caspian and Central Asian regions. And this fits the idea of isolating China, because China is the major buyer of energy resources from this region. And those forces who control this region control prices and control deliveries of energy resources. They essentially control economic development of other countries. And the One Belt, One Road project, enormous project, which was launched by China, obviously designed to get access, landlocked access to the world market, which US Navy are unable to cut. And from standpoint of US elite, it is a very dangerous project, and Russia should thwart it. While in fact, Russian elite in 2000s made very different attempts. Eurasian Union obviously is designed to secure a leading role in former Soviet space for Russia. And some other acts irritated United States very much. Putin's Munich speech, where Russian president reminded to the West its obligation taken in oral form to Gorbachev that NATO will never expand to the east 1 inch. The 5-day war in southern Caucasus, which was prompted by the struggle for transport infrastructure to transport energy resources to the region, and where proxy, in fact it was a proxy war started by United States through their proxy regime in Georgia, which attacked two breakaway republics, which were seen as Russian allies. And by initiative on Syrian chemical weapons crisis, when Russian diplomacy prevented direct involvement of US military in overthrowing Assad regime, and thwarting agreement on association of Ukraine with EU, which had very strong anti-Russian articles, and Putin suggested better financial conditions for Yanukovych, Ukraine president of the time, in order to stop this agreement from being signed. All this irritated United States. But what were they the acts of Cold War? According to Richard Sawa, professor of international relations from University of Kent, United Kingdom, it is not revisionist, but neo-revisionist strategy. Under revisionism, Western political science understands change of the current world order. And Sawa argues that Putin's strategy is not to change the world order per se, but to change the practice of the world order. Namely, he demands to respect to regional interests of Russia in exchange for Russian support of the current world order. I am not sure that this strategy is realistic, but it is very far from Cold War waged by the communist Soviet Union. And these processes of deep internal changes, evolution of the Soviet society, and evolution of the global capitalism they explain us the nature of Ukraine crisis. In fact, Ukrainian capitalism is a purely peripheral, and it is economically very inefficient since it is based on even greater extent of transfer of Ukrainian wealth to transnational corporations. You can see GDP decline and change, and even more, what is even more important, change in the structure of GDP, because now service sector enormously had grown at the expense of industry and agriculture, and service sector is represented by financial operations which are more damaging to the economy, and I can't understand why they are included in GDP. They should be subtracted from GDP, in fact. Now, if we move to the real economic trends, then we have this seeping out enormous capital flight from Ukraine, which is estimated by the economists as roughly about 10% of national wealth being siphoned out from the country every year since breakdown of the Soviet Union. And of course, we see all the changes which were described by André Günther Frank in his development of underdevelopment thesis. We have changes in the structure of Ukrainian economy. Once it was the most prosperous in industrial terms of all the Soviet republics, and now it is reduced to a few industries. And even more impressive is the change of the social structure of Ukrainian society, where powerful oligarchs appeared and most of the population was impoverished. And since Ukrainian oligarchs, just as their Russian colleagues, keep their money in the West, they are very dependent on Western elite, and in fact they represent the major tool of Western influence in the country. United States undertook serious and persistent attempts to develop lots of instruments to control all major spheres of life, of social life of Ukrainian society. And it includes not only comprador oligarchs keeping their money in the West. About 1,000 non-government organizations were operating in Ukraine, and they were directed by American and other Western embassies, and they represent a very wide range number of tools. They took under control major media, and they have specialization in journalists, in TV journalists, internet editions, even bloggers, and all aspects of civil society are affected by non-government organizations. Major political parties dominating the right-wing spectre of Ukrainian policy, and those parties which came to power, ousting from power Yanukovych, they are all established and largely financed by the West. And their major politicians, for instance, it is well known that Batkivshina and personally Yatsenyuk, they are pro-American party. Udar is a German party. In fact, its creation was financed by Germany, and Klitschko is a German citizen, and his business is in Germany, and he earns much more in Germany than in Ukraine. And his party is modeled on Christian Democratic Party of Germany, and it was created with the advice of this party. And even a very right-wing neo-Nazi Svoboda party, headed by Technibok, it established close relations with the Republican Party of the United States, and McCain is his first friend, and they have handshakes and all that. And he had even problems, Technibok, with rank-and-file members of his party who are not only Ukrainian nationalists, but they are anti-Westerners as well. But he explained that, look, we live in the real world, we have to be realists, we have to take into account who has power and money in the country. Many civil society organizations were under tacit control of the West in Ukraine, and even nationalist militant groups. There are facts that they were trained. I think a few years, different groups of militants were trained at military bases of NATO countries, including Poland and Baltic states, and some other countries as well. So I think that if we take in whole the tools of Western influence on Ukrainian society, then we have a whole infrastructure of control over ostensibly independent nation, and this infrastructure was put to a good use in course of Maidan insurrection, which is a classical example of a coward revolution. But what were the aims of United States in Ukraine? I described the general situation why United States would like to contain Russia and put it under control. But Western ruling elite realizes that Ukraine is the most vulnerable point for Russia. It is the most important country after Russia in the post-Soviet space. It is populated by largely Russian-speaking population. It is most close in cultural terms. Only Belarusia can compete with Ukraine in its cultural and historical closeness to Russia. And of course, Ukraine is the most advanced industrial potential, and it is very important for Russian economy, including military production, and cooperation between Russia and Ukraine in the industrial sphere was very high all years after breakdown of the Soviet Union up to the victory of Euromaidan in Kiev. And Zbigniew Brzezinski made his famous saying that it cannot be stressed strongly enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. And anti-Russian plans in Ukraine included ousting Russian fleet from Sevastopol, which efficiently would deprive Russia to its access to southern seas, and deployment of the 3rd district of US anti-missile system on Ukrainian soil, which will virtually undermine Russian nuclear shield. And the flying time of a missile from Ukraine to Moscow is about 5-7 minutes. Achieving these aims, the United States would reduce Russia to a negligible country, and this was not what any reasonable government would tolerate if it wants to keep power. And this had led to abortive bourgeois-democratic uprising. I believe that Euromaidan in Kiev, for majority of its participants, was a bourgeois democratic movement. Nationalists accounted to about 10% of participants of Euromaidan. However, it was abortive from the very beginning because it tried to establish bourgeois democracy in frameworks of peripheral capitalism. And since it was tacitly directed by external forces, it was designed to entrench peripheral character of Ukrainian capitalism. And in such case, democratic aims of this movement were unrealistic, unattainable. And you see the real expression which used Obama, who boasted that United States brokered power transition in Kiev. And of course, Maidan ideals had failed. Corruption became even more rampant, which is explained at this slide above. New powerful oligarchs came to power after Yanukovych. Economic chaos followed, and further decline of living standards happened. These all are fruits of peripheral capitalism. In fact, at the foundation of a coward revolution, it is always exploitation by external forces of the justified indignation of people, which was caused by the very nature of peripheral capitalism, even if people do not understand that. But Russian-speaking population, which, as you can see from this map, is huge in Ukraine. It followed events in Kiev with growing concerns, because with the violent takeover of power by Maidan, Russian population virtually lost its political presentation in Kiev. And anti-Russian neo-Banderovsky forces took power. And one of the first acts of their legal acts after coming to power was depriving Russian language of its legal status as one of official languages of Ukraine. Here you can see at this photo some slogans of Ukrainian nationalists which were openly demonstrated these days. Death to the Russians, it is written, more murder. And these were not only words. You can see the tragic events in Odessa, where pro-Russian activists were burned alive. That is how Donbass uprising happened. It was not, it was supported by Russia, I believe, but it was not caused by Russia. Uprising embraced all southeast of Ukraine and happened in other regions as well, in Kharkov, which is more important, in Odessa, in Kherson, in all over southeastern Ukraine. But it succeeded only in Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk. This was, I think, essentially national liberation movement with strong social inclinations, because after success of anti-Maidan or Euromaidan in Kiev, the Russian population of Ukraine felt that it now suffers increase of social oppression and national oppression as well, because the new power in Kiev is very nationalistic. That is how this uprising happened. And of course, it was very facilitated by reunification of Russia with Crimea, which was supported by the overwhelming majority of Crimean population, and which by no means was in any sense imperialist move, because it was purely defensive. I explained already that, and you know, a few weeks before coup d'etat in Kiev, a group of battleships, including battleships with nuclear weapons, went to Black Sea, and in fact it was intended to enter Sevastopol, because the new regime, it was planned that the new regime will immediately tear all agreements on Sevastopol base, which were signed by previous government, and Americans will take over this naval base. This was a threat which no reasonable government could tolerate, and that is how reluctantly Putin's leadership moved to take over Crimea. As it is known today, Putin for some time toyed with the idea of making it just as South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Let them proclaim their independence, we will support them, militarily protect them, but we will not include them in Russia. But he was explained that it is a very different case, stakes are much higher, and it is not a reasonable and realistic approach. We have either step aside, either move decisively. That is, and of course it influenced Donbass and other southeastern regions to rebel. However, here we see that Russian support of rebels was very half-hearted. On the one hand, Putin really didn't allow military takeover of pro-Russian republics. But on the other hand, he prevented unrecognized republics from radically expanding their sphere of control. After, in August 2014, Ukrainian army was virtually completely defeated. It was completely disorganized. It lost discipline. It started retreating without orders. Commanders deserted. nearly 60% of tanks and other military vehicles were destroyed, so they had no real military resources at the moment to stop spreading of people's republics. But this was stopped by Moscow, not by Washington, which doesn't fit either Cold War, either two imperialism paradigms. And Russian leadership refused to officially recognize Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which made enormous unfavorable impression on many Russians and on people in Donbass as well. And it enforced on Donbass Minsk agreements, which, as we believe in Russia, are much more favorable to Ukrainian side than for Donbass. In fact, Russian state prevented overgrowth of national liberation movement in Donbass into socialist revolution because two major types of participants in Donbass revolt, nationalists, patriots, and leftists, they all shared the idea that we should nationalize main means of production, we should redistribute national income in favor of workers, and we should establish and we should shift power to the people. Of course, the last thing is controversial. Different people understand different things under people's power. However, the first two things, nationalization and redistribution of wealth, was absolutely shared by all participants of all kinds and persuasions. But this was prevented. If not the Russian state, the Russian government, there would be no big private property in Donbass in a few days after success of rebellion. And so, I have last few minutes, and I should say that the major idea which puts together the question of the legacy of Russian Revolution, of evolution of global capitalism, and of the nature of Ukrainian crisis is the law of uneven and combined development, which is in turn just an application of the major law of capitalism, accumulation of surplus value. And it was the success of Russian Revolution and then its later degeneration which created the current, which shaped the current societies both in Ukraine and in Russia. And it was the same law which determined the current world economic crisis and determined the position of Russia and Ukraine in modern system of international relations. I think that the major lesson which is given by Ukrainian crisis is that in fact it is impossible in the conditions of total crisis of capitalism to establish any prosperous national-oriented capitalism which do not belong to the core. Russian attempt to strengthen its semi-peripheral status in the world capitalist system, I think from historical perspective failed because we live, it appears, in the age of total negation. Just look, Tsarist Russia was negated by Russian Revolution, which partially was negated by Stalin's Thermidor, which was negated by restoration of capitalism. But modern Russian capitalism is actually negated nowadays by the total crisis of capitalism. I would like to know what story Hegel would draw from this idea. So the only solution for big and small problems of peripheral and semi-peripheral countries is socialist revolution, moving ahead, stopping trying these failed attempts to find a proper place under capitalism and moving ahead to real, genuine socialism. Thank you for your attention.
I'm going to open up the floor to questions. The clock on the wall is running about 7 or 8 minutes fast. So by my official time, We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and then we can conclude at about 10:30. That will still leave us enough time to refresh and refuel before the beginning of the next session at 10:45. I think what I'll do is maybe I'll take 2 or 3 questions to begin with, and then let Ruslan respond to those. And there is a microphone that will circulate, and so I'll begin with 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I have many questions, I will only ask one. When you talked about 19th century development of capitalism in Russia, financed by Russian grain exports produced by the Russian peasantry, I think, if I remember correctly, that the breadbasket was Ukraine and the peasants were Ukrainian. I'm curious about this.
Well, Ukraine was one of the most important producers of grain in Russia, but also Povолжье, also Siberia. In fact, Siberia produced lots of agricultural products. So it was not only Ukraine, all southern Russia, including Krasnodar, Rostov, Stavropol, they also produce lots of grain. So it is not only Ukraine, but Ukraine was very important, yes. No doubts about that. But Ukraine was also important in terms of industrial development. And Tsarist Russia he invested a lot in Ukrainian industry. It was this time when Donbass appeared as an important industrial zone. However, it was not, Donbass was not Ukraine at the time. It was moved to Ukraine by Lenin because Ukrainian society was largely agricultural, and he wanted to increase the workers' representation in this region, and that is how Donbass became Ukrainian. But yes, Ukraine was important.
Second question. I've forgotten who I identified. Yes, correct.
Thank you for your very enlightening presentation. I'm John Riddell from Toronto. I wonder if we could take a look at the drama that you have described from the Ukrainian side. And I think some facts we would wish to review here is that Ukraine as a political entity is a child of the Russian Revolution. It did not exist before. But in the decades that followed, its integrity and independence was several times challenged in war, and it was preserved only through alliance with the Soviet Union as a whole and with the Russian people. That Ukraine's growth as a distinct political entity was made possible through a historic compromise between the Ukrainian majority and the very large Russian minority in the country. And that finally, although Stalin has a very great deal to answer for in terms of crimes against Ukraine, the broad tendency of Ukrainian evolution within the Soviet Union was indicated by the fact that it could so easily and rapidly accede to the right to independence guaranteed under the Soviet Union Constitution.
Yes, very correct. There is nothing to add.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Manager Doraj from TCU in Texas, USA. I have a couple of questions. One is, what would you make of what seems to be a strategic alliance emerging between China and Russia, which manifests itself in Russia joining Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia joining the BRICS, and Russia joining the Bank for Development and Infrastructure, all initiated by China. And of course, China in turn has signed a treaty that would bring 400 billion worth of natural gas from Siberia into China as one example of expanding economic ties in face of what seems to be increasing tension between the West and China. Do you think this is a marriage of convenience, temporary alliance, or would we see this as an enduring alliance which is intended to create a new world order or new balance of power globally?
Thank you. Very interesting question. It is a highly debated topic currently in Russia. 10 or 15 years ago, Maxim Primakov, one of the most influential politicians in Russia, suggested that we should, at the face of pressure from the United States, we have to form a new axis which will unite India, Delhi, Moscow, and Peking. I think it is a strategic move on the part of Russian leadership to increase their ties with China, to diversify economic relations and access to markets, not only to the West but to the East as well. And this tendency strengthened after anti-Russian economic sanctions. And it is even much more than that here. Putin pressed some oligarchs to invest in Far East in some enterprises which will produce semi-processed materials to supply to China. And he even invited for investment in these enterprises some important financial groups from the United States which invested in Chinese industry. And these new plants which are currently constructed are designed to supply products for this industry in which some American interests are involved. And ostensibly it is to develop backward Russian region, to increase industrial production in Russia, linking to Chinese driving engine of trade. However, there is a political dimension here because Putin probably would like to get greater representation in American ruling class. So it is, of course, it is strategic. And you may say that in terms of bourgeois politics, it is quite smart and skillful move. But I think that despite all that, this scheme is superficial because it doesn't take into account the reality of global economic crisis, which is like explosion of a supernova, which will sweep away all planets around it. And Russian capitalism is one of these planets. Thank you.
Hi, Roger Annis from Vancouver and also with the newcoldwar.org website. I have a couple of points about Ukraine from your talk. I think that the central driving force of the if I could call it the popular participation in the Maidan movement, are the illusions in the European Union. That is, that austerity Europe, and we've seen what that has done in Greece, could bring economic and social progress to Ukraine. So I think that's a very important point to underline. Also, to ask the question and analyze, was Ukraine a subordinate? Did Ukraine before Maidan have a subordinate status to Russia? Because if so, then this would tend to argue in favor of the argument that Russia was simply continuing to subordinate Ukraine. But I don't think that argument stands economically, and I'd like to know, that's my one question to you, is your opinion on that. You said that the thesis of a Russian imperialism is false, and I think that's extremely important. And I think the failure of the Western left to address that issue is symptomatic of what I consider to be the collapse of the Western left in recent decades, of which the events in Ukraine, also in Syria, I would say, are symptomatic. And finally, the last thing, I'm very sympathetic to your treatment of Trotsky's view of the Russian Revolution, but I think there are too many imprecisions in the theory of permanent revolution, and also too many imprecisions in the Revolution Betrayed, which I agree is a very important text for understanding what happened after 1917. But I feel there are too many imprecisions in Trotsky's theory, such that it needs to be treated with great caution. And I think the proof of that is that the Trotsky's movement, such as it was, really no longer exists. And most of it bought into the anti-Russian propaganda over Ukraine. So that's my thoughts on a number of scattered points. Thanks.
Thank you. Concerning Revolution Betrayed, probably there are imprecisions, but I think that it is only natural that such large-scale forecast for such long historical perspective, probably it is inevitable to make it absolutely clear and without imprecisions. I just compare it to other opinions of the time, and I think that it was the most insightful analysis of the Soviet society. Although now we know much more about Soviet society than Trotsky knew, and we should suggest a deeper understanding than what was suggested by Trotsky. Speaking about Ukraine and its relation to Russia, I think in the Soviet Union, in political terms, everybody was deprived of any political rights. Ukrainians, Caucasians, people from Middle Asia, and Russians themselves. So, in certain sense, totalitarian states suppressed Ukrainian people, but not more than other peoples. In other respects, in terms of socio-economic rights, Ukrainians enjoyed great fruits of Soviet economic development. In Tsarist time, large portion of investment was directed to Ukraine, and in Soviet time it continued. Ukraine was one of the most prosperous Soviet republics. And after obtaining independence, the ruling class of Ukraine had chosen mainly Western direction of integration. And the immediate cause for Maidan uprising was that Yanukovych declined agreement on association with the European Union. But this association by no means was agreement of equal partners, because ostensibly Europe opens its market for Ukrainian goods, Ukraine opens its market for European goods. But in fact, in Eastern Europe, there are adopted more than 20,000 very strict standards on industrial production which regulate every aspect of industrial life. And Ukrainian economists calculated that Ukraine needed investment of more than 160 billion euros in 3 years in order to change its production to fit European conditions, which means that actually European market was closed for Ukrainian economy, while with Russia it has ties in manufacturing, and no European country could replace Russia in terms of industrial partnership. That is why after Maidan they simply cut all ties with Russia, and this facilitated decline of Ukrainian economy. In terms of export, 1 ton of export of average products exported from Russia or imported by Russia from Ukraine costed in 1990s a few times more than 1 ton of average goods imported by European Union. It is because Europe imported only some agricultural products, while Russia imported industrial products. Now they cut nearly all industrial relations with Russia, but Europe didn't fit this space, and this facilitated enormous decline and devastation of Ukrainian industry. So I think this gives us understanding about the understanding of economic relations, at least, between the two countries.
We're just about out of time, so I think maybe what I'll do is I'll take just a couple more comments, and maybe I'll take the comments in sequence, and then I'll let Ruslan have the final word. So maybe 1, 2, 3 up in the corner, and then Anna as the final word. And my apologies, but please be mindful of the time, because we're just trying to squeeze in a few last minutes.
Yeah, my question is regarding developments in the Donbass, and particularly around the question of Mariupol. Now, if the government, the people of Donetsk, wish to become an autonomous country, why, if they had the military power, why didn't they take control of Mariupol, which would have guaranteed their independence as an independent state?
Very good question. Mariupol is a very important port at the Black Sea, and it is important from standpoint of exporting military steel product, metal products from Ukraine. And in summer 2014, Donbass forces nearly had taken over Mariupol, and Ukrainians had no military resources to defend it. But suddenly they stopped, moved back, and Mariupol returned to Ukrainian domination. I believe that it reflects some behind-the-scene compromises between Russian elite, Ukrainian and Western elite, because they never cut ties. And for instance, Ukrainian oligarchs who owned, Akhmetov, for instance, who owned industrial plants in Donbass, they are still in a possession of these plants. They were not nationalized. They operated, and the profit would go to these oligarchs, and they would pay. They paid taxes both to Kiev and to Donetsk Republic. And there were lots of compromises, and Akhmetov was an intermediary between Kiev and Moscow, would go there and return in Kiev again, and they were interested, and there was some agreement between them, and Mariupol was just given in exchange of some concessions on their part, I believe. If not Moscow control over Donetsk Republic, they would catch it.
I'm Razan from Pakistan. Thank you for your fantastic presentation. I would just like to draw your attention to the fact you said that the United States and the West would like Russia to join them in the balkanization of China. But that might not be necessary, because I think India is playing that role really well. And also, Japan is now toying with the idea of having a militarized constitution. So we know who's doing that. We know who's instigating. There's a whole debate in Japan right now whether they should also have an army. But it is being played in the rhetoric of Korea, but I don't think that's directed against Korea, it's directed against China. Also, I think if the West wants to balkanize China, they have a range of options. I mean, there's Xinjiang, where the Uyghur community is being worked up. There is the issue of Tibet, which is also frequently mentioned in the West as a human rights issue, and also Taiwan. So I'm not really convinced that Russia, there are so many options available to the West to balkanize China, within China as well, and also with the debate on India, and as well as Japan. So what do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Just leave it for a second. I'll take two more comments.
Hi, Ruslan. I'm Jeff Sorrell at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. And by the way, I'm going to be speaking in about 5-10 minutes on this very topic in one of the panels on food. So, of course, this fantastic presentation is very relevant. One of the issues that you raised becomes a little problematic to me in the sense that it seems to me international politics, and politics in general, even for the left, often is the art of the possible. So if you look at Putin and you see what he's doing in Ukraine, it sounds almost utopian to think that he would in any way support the people's republics in a sense. And yet, on the other hand, it seems to me, and even from a leftist perspective, being anti-NATO and being anti-US imperialist, which objectively I think Russia's positions have been, right? In Ukraine, for example, he made this offer of a $15 billion loan to Ukraine. It's a lot of money. He would lower gas prices, right? There would be probably a much greater integration of their industry. So in a sense that would certainly benefit at least the Ukrainian people. Would be, in a sense, could you say it would have been progressive policy to have this kind of more integration with Russia, and that therefore, in that sense, Putin's policy could be looked at as, on the other side, progressive, relatively progressive.
One last comment, Anna.
Thank you so much. And University of Saskatchewan. I can speak. I used to teach large classes. And my question, it's interesting things and certainly interesting and more or less coherent idea, but I want you to have it less vulnerable when it comes to critiques that certainly could come from historians. First of all, from historians. Because coming back to your stories of industrialization, in 1916, Russia's population, peasantry, comprised up to 80% of Russia's population. That's about how industrialization was finished, not finished. But point is, Socialist Revolutionary Party, essence, were the major party of Russian peasantry. You never mentioned Socialist Revolutionary. And immediately when it comes to Kornilov's uprising and Kerensky, I don't have sentiment for Pavel Milikov and his constitutional democratic government, but certainly when Kerensky has become the head of provisional government, and Kerensky was a member of Socialist Revolutionary Party, and where all this stands when it comes to actually elections to Constitutional Assembly and SRs won a majority of seats, and how this can be reconciled with Bolsheviks, and because we have a lot of stories here and a lot of debates. And this is going to be the most vulnerable point here, because Bolsheviks were, perceived by many other non-Marxists, but still socialists, as actually, traitors, or coup or whatever, but certainly not a revolution. And I want to know your stance on that. Story of essence.
We have, I'll give you a couple minutes just to wrap up, and answer is given the time.
I think we will discuss in more details your questions in free time. I would like only to answer the question about peasantry. Of course, peasantry was comprised of 80% of the population. Are you hearing me? Yes. So, peasantry was the greatest part of Russian population, and that is why its position was so important for the fate of Russian Revolution. But I think that in provisional government, not social revolutionaries and Mensheviks dominated, but liberal bourgeois parties dominated, and I think that Kerensky was more oriented on their influence than on the influence of social revolutionaries and on peasantry. And because of Kornilov uprising, in result of Kornilov, or failure of Kornilov uprising, Bolshevization took place in Petrograd. And Petrograd was the most important for the future of revolution. And here I think Bolsheviks, after Kornilov uprising, became the most influential party, because they started dominating the Petrograd, how is it called in English? Garnison in Russian. Garrison, yes. Thank you. Petrograd garrison, and workers and Petrograd garrison became the most important actor of history. And Petrograd dominated the country. That is why Bolsheviks winning only 25% of seats in the Constitutional Assembly, they became the dominant power. But Constitutional Assembly itself was, I think, in a certain sense, depreciated by a strategy of liberal bourgeoisie, which put off convening of this assembly. Because the major, most pressing problems of revolution was solved by Bolsheviks at the Second Congress of the Soviets. And only after that, the Constitutional Assembly gathered. And this made Russian people quite indifferent to the fate of the Constitutional Assembly and played in the cards of Bolsheviks. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for attending today, for your comments, questions, joining me. Thank you for very stimulating presentation.